Occasionally, eras in history get their own names. In fact, maybe that's what defines an era, is if we can give something a name so that it describes something. Reconstruction, the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, and now we have the COVID years. Recently, on HBO's hit The Last of Us, a character described how the collapse of society occurred over a weekend. Sounds far-fetched, except for the fact that it had echoes in real life. On Thursday, March 20th, the year 2020, the National Basketball Association announced suspension of the rest of its season. By Monday, the first of the shelter-in-place orders were issued by governors. We had entered the COVID era. One of the many unfortunate results of the pandemic is the exacerbation of inequality. How does increased inequality threaten democratic governance? What steps might be taken to address that increase in inequality as pandemics continue? Joining us for these topics is Dr. Stephen Bezruchka, faculty member of the Department of Global Health, the Department of Health Sciences at University of Washington, author of the recently released Inequality Kills Us All. It's not an optimistic title. Hopefully there's some optimism in the conversation. COVID-19's health lessons for the world. Professor Bezruchka, I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Welcome to Democracy Nerd.
Thank you very much, Jefferson, for having me. Yes, you pronounced my name correctly. Thank you.
Before we delve into the book, I want to hear your story a little bit. This is not your first book. Your previous books were, I think, backpacking guides in Nepal. This seems a bit different from that. Tell us the story.
So I was a mathematics graduate student at Harvard in the late 60s, and I decided I wanted to do something more useful, like provide medical care. And from the time I decided to apply to medical school, I had a gap year, what people call a gap year now. So what to do with that year? Well, I'd spent a lot of time in the mountains and here in the Pacific Northwest and elsewhere. And so I decided to go to Nepal to get close to the highest mountains in the world. So I spent a year walking the hills and valleys in the country and wrote a guidebook to that process. I called it Trekking in Nepal. And it was published in 1972, and I kept on revising it. The last edition came out in 2011, and it's the last one. I'm far too lame to try to revise it again. But what that did was give me an insight into a country described as one of the poorest countries in the world, but it was a very welcoming country. That is, had few miles of roads, and anybody's home was a B&B. In other words, as you traveled throughout the country, there were no tourist facilities, so you stayed in people's homes, saw what they ate, shared their meals, and traveled from village to village, and sometimes crossing high passes and other adventurous things. Based on that, I had applied to medical school, deciding I wanted to do mathematical modeling of cancer research, of cancer processes. But after that year spent in Nepal, I decided it was much more relevant to try and provide healthcare services in very disadvantaged situations. So when I went to medical school, that became my goal, how to learn skills that would be useful. And I was successful in doing that. I went to Stanford Medical School in the early 70s, and they were quite comfortable with letting students design their own learning issues. So after that, in 1974, I went back to Nepal to set up a community health project a week's walk from the road. So imagine, here you are, a week's walk to get to where you're going to live and work. And I tried to, what I tried to do is train local people locally in skills that would be appropriate for them to take care of health problems of people living there. And this was a high valley, about 9,300 feet, and that was perhaps one of the most satisfying experiences of my life. I then came back into the United States. I worked as an emergency doctor, but my habit for Nepal, I had to, I had to go back and keep updating the trekking book. And in the 1980s, using my experiences in the 70s, I set up a remote district hospital as a teaching hospital for Nepali doctors and supervised them. So I got a chance in the 70s to gain experience using in an unresourced setting, teaching others, and then I got to do that for Nepali doctors, people who'd graduated from medical school and were working in remote areas. And I continued to do that, working with Nepali doctors to try and improve services in remote district hospitals. Anyway, along the way, I came to see that health status in the United States was not what I expected. Here we are with a very sophisticated healthcare, medical care system, and yet we're not that healthy if the standard is comparing how long we live to people in other countries. So when I went to, when I went to medical school in 1970, some 17 countries, people in some 17 countries had longer lives than we do. This really puzzled me. I thought the United States should be one of the healthiest countries in the world. I then became obsessed with trying to understand this. So in 1992, I went back to public health school to gain an understanding of public health and try and answer my question. And so I came away with the recognition that I already knew medical care didn't do much, that social and political factors really mattered most. And so by 1995 or so, I became obsessed with trying to make American health status better known to people here and to try and do something about it. That's a rather long story I could even lengthen, but that's enough.
Well, let's use that as the prologue to the spark that gets you to say, you know what, not only do we need to write about the health system, understand it, but let's look at the connection, and more deeply the connection between inequality and COVID and pandemics. Was there a given moment, either in the mountains of Nepal or the halls of a reunion at Harvard or in class at the University of Washington, that said, no, this is the thing I got to write, and I'm the one who's got to write it?
So about 1993 or 4, I came across studies linking income inequality to mortality rates in countries. And the first studies appeared in 1979, and by the mid 90s, there were a number of studies, and I wanted to see, should I believe these? I mean, there's so much information out there. Is this something that is important? It felt right to me because I saw class divides. I grew up in a working class neighborhood. I then raised my class or caste status by going to prestigious schools. And it was easy to look down upon people who didn't have these qualifications. So I then got in touch with some of the important researchers in this, and I spent much of the latter half of the 1990s doing this to convince myself that inequality was bad for health. And I came up with my first book proposal in 1996. So it's been a long time in the oven. But I think it's important to,
Yeah,
uh,
1996. That is not all. There are ovens that don't last, 27 years. So it's good that the idea has lasted longer than maybe a bad oven.
yes, yes.
Richard Wilkinson, I know, did his TED talk on the impact of wealth inequality, income inequality on nations, and I suspect you're drawing from the same research. And what struck you the most? I mean, I know that his basic thesis is once you reach a certain level of wealth in a nation, getting wealthier as a nation doesn't seem to have particular impacts, particularly improvements on public health or really anything else any other indicator of human health and happiness. But inequality certainly does. And is a big driver. What struck you most about that, or what story or example or even small piece of data helps illustrate that, either that you enjoy talking about in class or that you use in your work?
So Richard Wilkinson has been a major influence on my thinking. I wrote him after I saw his 1992 British Medical Journal study, and we corresponded. And then he came to Boston to meet with other researchers, and so I spent a month with him, sort of exploring the Northeast and coming to understand his thoughts. I think that's really important. And there are a lot of ideas out there, and you have to sort of decide which ones really are meaningful to address the questions that you're asking. Thomas Pynchon wrote in Gravity's Rainbow, if they can get you asking the wrong questions, they don't have to worry about the answers. So coming up with the right question to ask, I think, is critically important. So, what does inequality do for health? Well, it makes us make comparisons with others. And in a high income inequality society, those environments are very stressful. And so we are exposed to the stresses that are produced when there's a big income or wealth gap. And that produces stress responses that, stress is there to get you out of trouble. But when you're worried about all sorts of stresses that aren't really immediately lethal, you come up with all the health problems that Americans have. I sort of uh, quipped that stress is the 21st century tobacco. Americans don't smoke much anymore. It's only the poor that smoke. But stress levels in this country are among some of the highest in the world. I present data to my students that, well, I coined the term health Olympics. We to be a metaphor for competition among countries. That is, we compete in Olympic events, countries compete, and we typically win the most medals, the most gold medals, except sometimes in the Winter Olympics we're second or third. If health were an Olympic event and the race was how long you lived, we wouldn't be there for the final day's race. We would have been disqualified in the trials. So we can have stress Olympics and rank countries by levels of stress. And we're somewhere in the top 5 or 6 of those countries. So
So we're in the unhealth Olympics. We do pass the qualifiers. We do maybe even get to take the stage and hold up a medal when it comes to the stress Olympics.
yes. So unhealth Olympics, I thank you for that, for planting that idea. What does it mean to be healthy? Well, for most of us, it's sort of how you feel. You get up in the morning and do you feel ready to face the day? Um, and then you're told all sorts of things to do to be healthy. Eat this, don't drink that, don't smoke, wear a condom. And when you put those things together and look at personal behaviors, as I did somewhere about 20 some odd years ago, uh, as an emergency doctor, I used to uh, just rail against my smoking patients who ended up in the ER with all sorts of problems that I had to try and fix to either get them admitted or street them. And so I thought smoking was about the most horrible thing you could do. And then I discovered the longest lived country had 3 times as many men smoking as the United States. I couldn't, that didn't compute.
Didn't make any sense.
Made no sense. So anytime you're faced with something that doesn't make sense, that's an opportunity to learn. You know, somebody said that trying to change your mind is one of the best ways of discovering whether you still have one. So how could I deal with the United States having relatively few smokers and yet being so unhealthy? So stress has replaced smoking as the 21st century tobacco, so to speak.
I want to use the tobacco, analogy, metaphor, what have you, as a way of thinking about stress. So with tobacco, we see it, we smell it. There's a specific habit that we can be criticized for that we can try to address in our own lives. There are products that can be sold to help us quit. We can chew certain gums. There's also a villain. There's somebody that we can have congressional hearings around and explain that they were selling people something they knew caused cancer when, well, after they knew that it caused cancer and lying about it. There are regulations that can help that are pretty specific. Don't smoke in the airport. Don't smoke in the airplane. Don't smoke in the restaurant. Increase the level of taxes on smoking. Sue tobacco companies and make them pay some price for having killed so many people from cancer. The fact that the country you mentioned had people living a long time wasn't because they smoked longer, it was in spite of it. So there's things that we can do with that. With stress, it's trickier. It's harder to see. You can't really smell it to my degree. I mean, maybe a dog can. There are many, many habits, right? Rather than one specific one. The villain, well, also sort of multivalent villains or nobody. Not clear, the regulations, not clear. No stress allowed in the airplane. I'm telling you, I get stress every time I get on an airplane. So how do you think, and maybe I'm jumping ahead too far, but not even before prescription, how do you even get people feeling like stress isn't just a soft, weak thing to talk about, that in fact is something real and tangible that we should care about, rather than just, you're just whining, complaining liberal?
So you were talking about stress getting on an airplane. So there's a phenomenon called air rage, namely belligerent behavior, intoxication, trying to smoke in the lavatory, sexual assault, not complying with the flight attendants or the pilots, and that's been studied. And studies that first appeared around 7 or 8 years ago, showing that air rage was greater in an airplane that had a first-class cabin and a coach cabin. And if you entered through the first-class cabin, the people in first class even showed more air rage compared to entering behind the first-class cabin. So the first-class passengers didn't have to see these plebeians moving by, which wigged them out. So that's air rage. And we live in a very class-conscious society. I mean, we're all middle class, so that's not true. But of course, we have highest rates of poverty of all rich countries, suggesting that we're not a middle class society. Anyway, so what's happened to air rage recently? Well, with COVID, the behaviors have really increased. COVID has caused a lot more air rage in the planes. It's caused road rage. I mean, you can see how we respond to seeing distinctions in society by class, or as Isabel Wilkerson writes, caste. We actually, caste is something that is fixed and immutable. I spent a lot of time in Nepal, which is very, which is a caste society, and people know their place in their caste, and they can't do anything to get out of it, and the rest of the people accommodate them or don't in various ways. This caste consciousness is actually there in the United States. It's really more important, she writes, than race or class. However, we don't talk about that. We talk about race in this country.
It's uncomfortable to talk about class because one of the ways that we have found ourselves to be special. Well, okay. It is a Super Bowl. I host a Super Bowl party, not because I celebrate concussions, but because I try to forget them when the Super Bowl comes around. And if you look at the history of football, one of the reasons that tackle football, one of the reasons it's called the wrong thing, right? Because like football, you don't use your feet very much in American football. And we call the thing you do use your feet a bunch. We call that soccer. And when you look at why tackle football became American football, people will analyze and say, well, one of the big reasons was it made us different than Britain. Our national sport was different than national sport because screw them, we beat them in a revolution. We're going to have a different sport than them. Okay. Similarly, I think one of the sources of national pride from our inception was this idea that we were not a caste society, that you could pull yourself up by whatever clothing type you chose to do whatever you might do. And that since probably eroded, you probably have a better timeline to it. I'd put the timeline right around 1980. We have been marching or dropping or drifting, if not inexorably, at least in a direction towards something that I think violates our understanding or our pride, our mythology, if not our understanding what our country is or what our country should be. What are your favorite ways of illustrating, or least favorite ways of illustrating that the idea of us as less of a class-based or less of a caste society than other places is hogwash, or why that matters so much other than air rage?
So where to go with that?
Wherever you want. It's barely a question, or it's 7, so you can take it wherever you want.
So, what should a country's goal be? What kind of society should it aim to be, or should it just keep the status quo? Well, I would offer that for people in a country, do they want to be healthy or not? Suppose you lived in a country where your chances of having a long, healthy life were low. Suppose that could be changed in the country in which you live. Would you want to change it or not? So countries have goals. Well, I remember in the 1950s when I came of age, Russia launched the satellite into space in 1957. It beamed a signal down to Earth, and we were caught totally unawares. So we were jolted into saying, my God, it's like the Chinese balloon, but this was a satellite. And so we said, this shouldn't be. We're going to set a goal to land a human on the moon by the end of the next decade. And so guess what? We accomplished that. Societies have goals at any point in their lives or trajectories. So we can ask, so in the 60s, the goal was to land a human on the moon. The goal in the 70s changed to something that really operationalized in the 80s, which was let's make the rich have as much money as possible, and that will be best for us because something will trickle down, and we'll be happy with whatever droppings the rich released. That was the neoliberal transformation of society that began. Why did it begin? Well, it began around the mid 1970s, and Business Week had a report in October 1974 that said it will be a hard pill for Americans to swallow. The idea of doing with less so big business can have more. Nothing in modern economic history compares in difficulty with the cell job that must now be done to make Americans accept the new reality. Why did that happen? Well, the richest 1%'s wealth share had plummeted. They only had a quarter of all the wealth, down from a half before. So, of course, they put in place policies to regain their wealth. And that was the neoliberal transformation. Ronald Reagan heralded very well with trickle-down economics. And it's been amazingly successful ever since, especially with COVID profiteering. Here we have the greatest inequality in American history, and that's thanks to the pandemic. So, whatever Business Week was writing about, namely the incredible selling job to make us accept the new reality, has been wildly successful. Yes, there's a little bit of talk. The State of the Union made some push to maybe tax the rich a little bit, but they won't allow that.
So I'll start with my quibble. It is my regular quibble. I should almost have a button on my thing. So anytime the word neoliberal is said, I quibble. And the reason is I just don't like the word. And the reason I don't like it is because it whacks the word liberal, which is not because I quibble with its contemporary definition, but because I don't think it's as useful a word as the people who use it seem to think, because it whacks the word liberal, which is confusing and maybe even counterproductive. I am still looking for a better phrase. Market fundamentalism it gets a little closer to how I'm trying to figure out how to talk about it. That is mostly beside the point, and I really appreciate what you had to say. I heard you say a couple other things that I wanted to pile on to. So one, if you put yourself behind a Rawlsian veil of ignorance, you're going to say, okay, what kind of society do we want to be? You'd say, if you're picking A, B, C, D, or however many, like, well, I want to go to the one where I'd have a chance of living longer and being healthier. And right now, you wouldn't pick the one that's winning the unhealth Olympics. You'd pick the one that was like at least making the finals of the health Olympics, and we're not doing that. And if you were going to define a moonshot as candidate for president, or heck, even as a candidate for city council, your moonshot might be, well, what if we made it to the health Olympics? It reminds me a little bit of the challenges, and you talked about the 1960s, of the challenges when Silent Spring was published about the natural environment. The time Silent Spring was published, most of the threats to the environment were point source threats, right? They were you find effluent, cap effluent, make a meaningful impact on the environment, right? I still think in our parlance, in our political habits, in our organization building, in our propaganda efforts, we understand a particular villain vastly better. We understand effluent that must be capped, rather than challenges that are happening because what each and every one of us are doing that either have to happen by lots and lots and lots and lots of micro habits, or are assisted by some collective contracting that we do. Hey, let's all make a deal. How about each of us could pollute a little bit less? Or if we pollute more, we pay a little more. Or how about each of us make a rule that we're not going to smoke on airports, right? Because I know that if we all smoke in airports, we're all screwed. I can make my choice, but if all of us make the same choice, we're screwing a bunch of other people, including ourselves. How do you go about, and I like the Health Olympics thing, how do you go about trying to communicate the idea, I guess maybe it's writing a book, that we have to figure out, because what occurs to me is that we need a new way of setting goals together. We need a new way of telling stories. We need a new way of understanding problem solving that goes beyond sort of hero narratives, beyond villain narratives, and beyond, just like identify specific problems, solve specific problem, and move on, because we got problems that are sort of complicated. How do you think that through, or how do you try to communicate it to others so that they'll think it through?
So I love the John Rawls veil of ignorance. I think that's a very important concept, namely, how would you design society if you didn't know where you were going to end up? I would offer that most people in the United States would rather live a longer, healthier life than a shorter, sicker one. What they don't know is that that choice is not available to them. We kind of confuse the situation by the words we use. We conflate health and healthcare. We pay for health, access health, get health, insure health. That's not what we're doing. We're paying for healthcare, insuring healthcare, accessing healthcare.
Or
So
sick
most
care.
Americans think it's health care that produces health. The terms mean the same. So first you have to ask people, do you want health or health care? Forget that we don't have universal health care, and a lot of people would love to have access to quality healthcare services. Um, but be that aside, healthcare is a minor player in producing health. That's a very tough thing to try and challenge. So I would more likely say, what are your chances of living a long, healthy life by being in the United States? They're not very good. I have my students, for example, compare a 15-year-old girl being alive at age 60 using United States and Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is not exactly a rich, advanced country. The 15-year-old Sri Lankan girl has a better chance of being alive at age 60 than the 15-year-old American girl. Same is true in Tunisia, Peru, in many other countries. It is clear you're more likely to not die during adulthood. We have very high adult mortality rates. It's worse for the poor. It's worse for African Americans. It's the worst for American Indians. But even rich whites, one way to look at that, the longest lived person at any one time is not in the United States. They typically hail from the longest lived country, Japan, or occasionally in other long lived countries. So, trying to communicate that our health as individuals in the world's richest, most powerful country that spends half the world's healthcare bill is not very good is a challenge. And how do you do that? Well, if people have traveled to other countries, then you can get them to make comparisons about lifestyles there and whether they impact health. If they have looked at data, I once asked. I was in a grade 8 class of privileged students talking about these ideas, and they were clearly confused. So I stopped and I said, how do you come to know something is true? There was silence. You know how uncomfortable silence is. I kept with the silence. Finally, a boy raised his hand and he said, if our parents tell us when we're very young, if our teachers and classmates reinforce it, and if we've experienced it, then we know it to be true. That is such a profound statement of epistemology. You got to hear it when you're young from people you respect. It's got to be reinforced by others that you trust, and you have to experience it. Now, it's very hard to experience population health data, mortality data, unless you work in a morgue or compile mortality data in Olympia or, in the state capitol and then send it to the National Center for Health Statistics. Unless you deal with those data, it's going to be very hard to experience what we're talking about. So at some point, you've got to trust others doing it for you. So how do you come to trust others? Well, studies on trust have shown that the more inequality in society, the less trust in one another and the less trust in government. So we've somehow, through this process of market fundamentalism or neoliberalism created vast inequality that has made us much less trusting of each other and of the government. And so we live in a society with a highly toxic, odorless, colorless, invisible gas, the gas of inequality, that kills us from all the usual diseases we die of, and we're totally unaware of it.
So I too, as were you, but I've not done nearly enough with it, but I too was impacted by Rich Wilkinson's work and I remember watching his TED talk and thinking, everybody's got to see this. And it only had, it has like a few million views. And to me, it should have 100 million.
Yeah.
Right. And I recognize that the people with the most financial capacity to spread messages probably don't prioritize his message as much as they might prioritize another one, because that basic idea, right? If you want to have impact on, for instance, we have done conversations here about social media, the impact that social media is having on trust, where you have fewer gatekeepers, where you have more people with wacky ideas, and in fact, where there can be an inverse relationship between truth and virality, right? That because if you say something that's really shocking, right, say something that is way different than what anybody else is saying, it will attract more attention and energy than something that is not shocking. And things that everybody knows, which for instance might be true, that you heard when you were young, that was reinforced by authority and by peers, that maybe you experienced, that kind of stuff is boring, doesn't get retweets, doesn't get likes. But something that is different, maybe you never heard it, or it was never really reinforced, or you haven't experienced it, or it relates to one of those things, but violates something else, well, that can get extra virality. That can get more likes, more retweets. So we then saw social media as a thing. But maybe what you just said is that it ain't just social media that's impacting the less trust. It is the fact that we have more inequality than we had in 1979 and 1983 and anytime since probably. When do you think? I usually use my shorthand, sort of the Gilded Age, and I don't know if there's a perfect equality or inequality curve. Somebody's got one better than I do in my head. The way I basically think about it is that real bad, 110 years ago, right, give or take, post-Civil War to maybe World War II. The dip was probably somewhere in the midpoint between those two eras. And then World War II to about 1980, that's when we had the strongest middle class. And then it's been sliding since. Do you have a better, quick way, or as long as you want, sort of describing sort of the curvature of inequality? And that reinforces then that idea, well, maybe that's why it's not just change in communications technology. It's that we're more stressed out. We don't trust each other as much because we don't feel the world is very fair.
So let's go back a few 100,000 years.
Good. That's a good place to start.
For most of human existence, 95, 99%, we lived as hunter-gatherer, forager, hunter societies. And what do we know about that period? Well, we don't have record keeping from way back then, but we do have skeletons from back then. And skeletons are either have bones, the bones may be fossilized. You can measure the bones. If you measure the bones, take the femur, the thigh bone, is pretty easy to measure. And then you date various measurements using carbon dating or whatever, and you find that bones started to get shorter. And they started to get shorter about 10,000 years ago, when we made the transition from foraging and hunting to agriculture. That was a major transition, and all evidence points to health declining with the progress, if you want to call it, of agriculture, because inequality increased. From all we know about hunter-gatherer societies, they had vigilant sharing. That is, if anybody got the only thing they had to share was food. And if anybody got a smaller portion of the kill, it was the hunter, because he could always go out and get more. And if the hunter tried to get more than his share, at least studies among modern day hunter-gatherer groups show these people would be shamed or ostracized or even if necessary executed because they threatened the stability of that society. So equality, well, first of all, health declined with the progress of agriculture and inequality increased. How did inequality increase? Well, somebody could say, I'm your lord or master. I want you to build me a castle surrounded by a moat to store the food you produce for me and go to war to protect my resources. And there we have inequality writ large. And all the data are uniform that health declined. It was at a very low level. If you measure, again, skeletal height or stature. You know, I remember visiting the Tower of London to see the armor of Henry VIII and other major figures during that period. Those dudes had small statues. They weren't very tall. You visit old English cathedrals where they have old grave boxes. You know, I did this with Richard Wilkinson. Actually, we couldn't fit into the grave boxes; they were too short. So, the people that we compare ourselves to show our progress a couple of hundred years ago were some of the shortest people who ever lived. Now, since then, we've grown taller. And at the end of the 19th century, Americans were some of the tallest in the world. We could claim pretty good health status. Now, taking height as a measure, all the Western European countries are taller than we are. You see this with Army recruits. That's one place where you can measure people's height. You know, when you joined the Revolutionary Army, they documented how tall you were, and you wanted tall recruits. These days, you know, it's a poverty draft, and we don't have those measurements. But so something happened in the last couple of hundred years, and health started improving. And I think that was because the standard of living improved. You know, we had sewage was trucked away. You know, the water supply was separated from the sewage. We had clean water, clean food, better housing conditions. And public health people say that was what produced the greatest health improvements up to somewhere in the middle of the last century. And since then, you know, the studies are that more equal societies have faster health improvements. And as we become more unequal, and especially with the pandemic profiteering, our health has actually declined. It's been declining in some measures since 2015, and from 2019 to 2021, there were major health declines in the United States that were not present in the other rich countries. Our ship is sinking, you know, and I make the Titanic analogy. If you had a first class ticket on the Titanic, 60% survived, second class 44%, third class or crew a quarter. So, you know, that's the class differences in survival, which are still there today in our ship. And the only thing that's happened is that COVID has made it much worse because of the vast increases in inequality.
So let's jump to that. So, because I'm trying, even going back to the tobacco thing, right? A challenge of pointing at stress and inequality as drivers of health disparities and of bad health and of low life expectancy, et cetera, is challenging. I mean, it's hard to see, right? And it's uncomfortable to talk. And it runs up against truths and mythologies around personal responsibility, right? If you're unhealthy, it's because you're fat. If you're fat, it's because you eat poorly. If you eat poorly, it's because of your own choices and because you're not moving enough, right? if we look at the aggregate, we know, well, yeah, but whether or not you have a sidewalk in your neighborhood is a really good indicator of whether or not you're going to have active transportation and be a little healthier. We know that your income level, your wealth level has significant impact on the kind of calorie you get to eat, right? And what actually the cheapest calorie in many of the countries you've mentioned are relatively healthy calories. The cheapest calories in the United States are very unhealthy calories. I'm still sort of grappling with how we tell the story, but I want to jump to COVID. I want to get to, because maybe this helps us understand, at least illustrate how inequality yields. And I did not say is related, it overlaps with or coincides with. I said yields, or I said causation, because that's the case you're making. You're making not only a correlation case, but a causation case. So it might help us illustrate that or untangle it. As I've thought about it, because I saw really early, right, that it looked like, well, the people of color and poor people were the people who were getting impacted by COVID more. And then it was the people who were not masking and not getting vaccinations. And if you were both, you were really screwed. And as I understood it, I understood a few things. One, if you're a frontline worker, you can't work from Zoom. You can't, if what you do is cut vegetables and fruits in a fruit and vegetable factory, you can't interact the way we're interacting now. Okay. If you clean something that needs to be cleaned in person, well, maybe there are not as many people around, but you can't do it. You can't mail that in. So that part I understood. I also understand, well, it's also related because there's a lot of social determinants of health, so that underlying health challenges that COVID can sort of latch onto and put you at greater risk for, well, those are also there as drivers of why economic inequality was such an indicator, and maybe a causal factor, but it's certainly an indicator, unassailably an indicator of disparate COVID impacts. Was there anything that surprised you when you started looking at COVID and relating it to inequality? Was anything what were the things that confirmed your priors most, might be your favorite examples? Was there anything that surprised you?
Where to start? First of all, you talked about correlation and causation. How do we decide that something causes something else? I think that's an important thing that even in public health departments or public health scholars are loath to say this causes that. They always hedge, or they tend to hedge, because they don't want to be proven wrong. So let's go back to the 1964 Surgeon General's report titled Smoking and Health. So back then, a large proportion of the population smoked. We doctors recommended certain brands as being milder on your throat. And suddenly this report, but we knew from studies starting in the 20s that smoking was bad for you. And of course, the tobacco companies knew this, but they just as the global warming corporations suppressed that.
Not only suppressed, but also did ads saying your doctor recommends smoking, also doing ads saying your T-zone will get cleaned out by cigarettes, right? They did more than just try to change the subject. They did more than just try to get you to ask a different question. They answered the question falsely, but please continue. And yes, I'm energized around it.
So what did the Surgeon General's 1964 report, Smoking and Health? It tried to present smoking as causing bad health. And it was the springboard for everything that followed. So how did they show causation? Chapter 3 lays out the grounds. You have to have many.
That was impressive, by the way. Anybody can quote chapters, but go ahead. I know it's a parlor trick. I know it. I know you work at a carnival. Keep going.
Yeah, don't believe a word I say. It's all made up. 94% of all statistics are made up on the spot.
I thought it was 72.
So they lay out the criteria. Many studies by many different investigators on different data sets over different times showing the relationship. Smoking causes worse health. The chicken or egg hypothesis. Did you get sick and then start smoking, or did you start smoking and then get sick? That's pretty clear. Were there better explanations? Something else that causes poor health rather than smoking. And finally, was there biologic plausibility? Were there biological mechanisms to explain that there's something about smoking cigarettes that changes your biology and makes you sick? And so if we ask that question for the inequality health relationship, all those criteria are met. And so, chapter 7 in the book is all about stress biology, showing that people lower down the economic spectrum have different biological constitutions that make them sick. So it's satisfied, and and of course Wilkinson and Pickett did a very nice research paper laying out all of these ideas. And as Wilkinson sort of implied in his TEDx talk, it's sort of now known that inequality is bad for your health by at least some segment of the population. But to link that to, so let's devolve now to COVID. Studies, so whenever I confront some new situation, I try to see what are the inequality precedents for this. So studies emerged at the end of the first year of the pandemic showing that mortality rates from COVID were among US states were highest in the most unequal states. Studies then emerged among countries, looking at 84 countries, showing that more unequal countries had higher COVID death rates, and their mechanism was because more inequality leads to less trust in and doing the sort of dictates that should help COVID outcomes. Something more recent is that the first 1,000 days, as you go from the erection to the resurrection, the first 1,000 days after conception are when roughly half of your health as an adult is programmed. So early life really lasts a lifetime. And studies on that, well, the ancient Greeks knew that, but in the modern era,
so I believe you just said, from the moment of conception to about 2 years old. That's about 1,000 days. Okay.
1,000 days.
So before somebody's making choices about what they eat, before somebody's making choices about where they live, or if they ride a bike versus ride a car, but well before they're making choices whether to smoke or doing that you're saying half of their
the die is cast.
The die is cast.
Yeah. And so again, what is the science behind that? So I only came across these ideas in around 1999 or so. And again, am I going to believe this? So I started attending conferences, international conferences. The cover term was Developmental Origins of Health and Disease. Developmental sort of is another word for early life development and how that produces health and disease in later life. So I attended the research presentations. I got to know the people that were doing these studies, and I reviewed the literature, and I said, boy, this is kind of incontrovertible. This is another one of these hard factual things that science bears out. Trying to get people to believe that is, well, as you said, and no, what really matters is whether you eat healthy choice foods or not. We've been programmed to believe it is individual agency in adulthood that matters most for health. Why is that? Well, there's a huge market share in selling products to people with the right labels, and we have testimonials. I mean, in the evening, I like to watch YouTube videos about a variety of things, and I don't pay extra so they don't come with ads, and the ads are often for really silly things that aren't going to make you healthy.
Pause there. This is another thing. So if you go to a convenience store or if you go to a movie, everything you see, everything you see is poison. And by the way, it's stuff I like to eat, right? I'm not like, I don't heed dietary wisdom near enough. In fact, I violate it regularly, right? And when I am trying to be healthy and I go to a movie and I look there and like, wait a minute, there's nothing here I'm supposed to eat. I go to a convenience store, nothing there I'm supposed to eat. Now imagine you live in a food desert where what you have nearby is a fast food restaurant, a convenience store. Yeah, you sort of have choices, but your choice is to walk 3.5 miles to try to find something that isn't poison. And by the way, do that when you didn't learn that from somebody earlier, when it wasn't reinforced by your friends or teachers, and you don't have that experience yourself. All right, keep going.
Okay. Two directions to go there. You mentioned movies. You know, they cast product placements in movies before they cast the actors. The products you see in movies are there for a reason. And, and that's an important insight. Anyway.
Well, yeah, because the product placement is a key piece of the capital stack to make the movie, right? You're saying, well, this is what it's going to take. We're going to meet, and we're going to get this much from our early producers. We're going to get this much from Alone. We're going to get this, and we're going to get this much because we put Pepsi Cola, drunk by some attractive person that we have yet to cast because we haven't yet got our budget approved to cast that person.
You really hit it on the coffin nail. So how important is diet? I mean, I was a vegetarian, vegan for a number of years. I mean, I've gone through all those experiences. And just like I discovered that smoking was not the hazard that I used to think it was, the healthiest prefecture in Japan. So let's dissect Japan. And until very recently, it was Okinawa at the southwestern terminus of the Japanese archipelago. And so Okinawans had among the best health status. And I had read that the Okinawan diet was mostly pork fat and noodles. So I went to Okinawa. I don't want to take somebody else's word for it. I had to see for myself. And I went to the markets, huge slabs of pork fat for sale. And I went to people's homes and ate their diet. It was pork fat and noodles. And what was their secret? Well, there's a Japanese saying, hari hachibu, stop eating when you're 80% full. Matters less what you eat, that you not eat too much of it. Yes, I think another dictum I learned in medical school.
Would you say the word again? I want the phrase again.
Hari hachibu.
Hari hachibu.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Stop eating when you're.
What is it? What is stop eating when you're 120% full? Because that tends to be my.
Well, that leads to people being bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
But
keep going.
Let's go back to early life.
Yeah.
If you are, first 1,000 days, first 9 months in the womb, what's a measure of how well you developed in your womb, in your mother's womb? It's your birth weight. If you are born of low birth weight, that is less than 2,500 grams, 5.5 pounds, your development has been compromised. And you are then subject to have more diabetes, more lung disease, kidney disease, hormonal cancers. Those are the studies that emerged from the conferences. Well, they emerged before those conferences. They were validated in the conferences I attended. So knowing your birth weight is a marker of how well you developed in your mother's womb. And if you had low birth weight and then had rapid catch-up growth, because that's what we used to tell people, if you were born small, really put on the calories in the first year or two. When you do that, you then become quite obese as an adult. And so that's because you are, whether it's a food desert or a calorie desert, you sort of want to regain what you didn't do in the womb. Now, among the factors that are important is brain development. So we have studies now showing that your birth weight correlates with measures of intellectual capacity. And so people with low birth weight, which are predominantly poorer people, they have compromised ability to benefit from education. Remember, in the United States, we feel that getting a college degree is the ticket to everything good. And so stay in school and get a college degree. Well, that doesn't work for example, African American women. Even African American women who have a college degree have more low birth weight babies than any other racialized group of any educational status in the United States. There's something about being African American in the United States that forever compromises what you can achieve. And so that gets into the issues of racism, which we can explore, but it also highlights the importance of early life. And how do we know this writ large? Well, in Florida, there was a study that enrolled every child, well, born from 1992 to 2000, and recorded their birth weights and how they did on standardized tests in grades 3 to 8. Forget whether standardized tests are a good measure of cognitive development, but they're probably closer to the mark than just guessing. Higher your birth weight, the higher your scores on the standardized tests. And we could break that data down by mother's education, by racialized identity, by poverty. You know, the worst is to be African American and poor, and that forever limits what you can accomplish. And being low birth weight, that limits forever what you can accomplish.
So how are these examples? I do want to use your term devolve. I do want to devolve more into COVID. A lot of these principles are generalizable. A lot of these are, about social determinants of health, about sort of the causal impact of income equality on health. Tell the story more about how that was so very pointed, so very obvious, so very illustrated during COVID.
Okay, so I talked about low birth weight being bad for you. So there's a study. So we have, in the United States, we have limited data availability to allow us to make these comparisons. But in Spain, they did a study in which they had adults who had severe COVID and were hospitalized or died or, had bad outcomes. And they were able to link those adults to their birth weights. And if they had low birth weights, their response as adults to COVID were much worse than those that had high birth weights, normal birth weights. So that's one very good study of early life compromising adult health. I've already mentioned the links between inequality and COVID outcomes. There are also studies on abuse during childhood. That's a whole other realm. Studies were first done in San Diego at Kaiser Permanente there in the 1970s by Vincent Felitti. And what he did was take obese women and do a supervised fast with them to get them to lose 100 pounds in a year or two. And quite a few were successful. And then he tracked these women, and he found that a large proportion of them put the weight back on as fast as they could. And so he was confused. And so he then began to question these women. Why did you put the weight back on? And a typical response was something like, well, when I lost that weight, I suddenly became sexually attractive to men. And weight was my body armor to be able to not have to deal with sexual advances with men because I was abused as a child. I was sexually abused by my father or or neighbor or whatever. So Felitti then teamed up with Anda, and they did a study in which they took all the patients enrolled in Kaiser and interviewed them for their early life adverse childhood experiences and followed them for 20, 30 years. Results were published only in 2008. It's hard for him to get them published, but they showed the more abuse you had as a child, the more your health was compromised, the more likely you were to shoot up, to have many sexual partners, to die young, and so on. So so they coined the term ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. And the more ACEs you have, the more compromised your adult health is going to be. So that's led to today, instead of this interview, there was a conference on trying to deal with ACEs. ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, have more or less come into specialty groups wanting to do something about them. We know that ACEs are common. They're common throughout the socioeconomic ladder, but they're more common among those who are poorer and those of racialized groups. But so far, there's no pill or surgical procedure to excise the effect of early abuse. So what do we know can help? Well, just being able to talk about your early life experiences, Felitti says, is a first step at therapy. Acknowledging these, having counselors or others be able to say, yeah, that really matters. Of course, mental health, and of course, a lot of mental health issues among those abused as children. And those who work as therapists know that if they probe an adult's early life and find various early life conditions, abuse or others, they can then use those to help the patient sort of deal with the issues that are going on. It's just another example of how early life lasts a lifetime.
I go to sort of use your move. I could go a lot of different directions with that. I'll say a couple of things. One, so I had childhood abuse, and and yeah, there's no pill, and talking about it helps. It also reminds me of when I completed law school and I was doing a pro bono project on a sentencing matter. Right, somebody had already been convicted, or maybe they'd already, I forget, maybe they'd already signed a plea agreement, and they were subject, and it was a federal case, and they were subject to the federal sentencing guidelines. And the federal sentencing guidelines were put in place because the critique, there was too much disparity between somebody who had committed some act and somebody else who committed what might seem like a similar act, and somebody get 30 years and somebody else get 3. They say, oh, that doesn't seem right. So we're going to create a cookbook and do it according to the cookbook. And there were first elements that got you up, and then elements that moved you down, got you a lighter sentence. And there was a specific specific exclusion about from the items that could get you down, the things that could give you a shorter sentence. And that was adverse childhood experience.
Really?
Adverse childhood experience could not get you lower down. And what was clear to me as a 27-year-old guy writing a memo on behalf of, somebody who was negotiating, navigating their sentencing was, oh yeah, because it impacts probably every single one of them. Like, hey, if that were, we should just lower the sentence by a year for everybody, because probably, I don't know, I would hesitate to say a percentage, but I know it'd be closer to 100 than it would be to 50.
So we can track child abuse deaths. Okay, there's a research group arm of UNICEF, Innocenti, based in Milan, Italy, and it issues a variety of league tables of various factors affecting children in rich countries. I first heard about this when Noam Chomsky mentioned child poverty in rich countries, a study. So that was again in the 1990s when I learned a lot. Anyway, so there are about 20 Innocenti reports of childhood circumstances in rich countries. And there's one looking at child abuse deaths in rich countries. And which country do you think has the most child abuse deaths?
Oh dear.
Yeah. Actually, to be honest, Mexico has a greater number of child abuse deaths, but not much. So I can show you graphs of all of these things. I can point you to the resources. Similarly, when it comes to poverty, we have, again, the most poverty, child poverty we're talking about, of all rich countries. They go on to look at other measures of well-being, educational outcomes, but that child abuse deaths is very sobering. Studies show as well that child abuse is linked to income inequality. So if the gap in income is greater, you get frustrated. And who are you going to take your frustrations out? Suppose you're at paid work and the job and the boss is giving you a pink slip. What are you going to do? Well, you're going to go home and take it out on your partner. What's she or he going to do? Take it out on the kid. What's the kid going to do? Well, there aren't many recourses. You can kick the dog maybe. So to cascade of put down relationships, and the bigger the gap, the more violent the cascade. And a modern day example, to bring it home, are the mass shootings we have in the United States. Yeah. They're no longer big news items. They're there every day. And why do we have so many mass shootings? Well, again, there are studies linking mass shooting defined as 4 or more victims per event. Let's try and make it standardized. Studies have appeared in the last 5-6 years showing that mass shootings are linked to high income inequality at the county level and the presence of high incomes. You need both high inequality and rich people. And then what does a low status person do? Well, you got to take it out on somebody else. So you take your AR-15 and go out there and kill.
If you have that data, I'd love it. I wouldn't love it. I would appreciate it.
No, it's. I think I linked to it in the book, Kwan and Cabrera paper.
Got it. Okay. All right. Well, I'll find it. Send it to me or I'll find it. And
I'll send them to you.
I appreciate that, because every time there's a mass shooting story, and I try to bring things back, and either when I'm talking here, sometimes when I'm guest hosting a radio program, is that each mass shooting is a inequality story.
Yep.
And it's pitched as a gun story, and it is a gun story. Guns are a real thing. It's also an inequality story. We never cover the inequality part, and it's part of this thing because you can't smell it. It's not like smoking, right? You can't see it, you can't smell it. It's a little bit harder.
There's no smoking gun. I mean, there is a smoking gun, but yeah, it's inequality that pulled the trigger.
So moving to solution promises too much. Moving to the future, moving to what we do about it. How do we make even just public health more sexy, more of a priority? How do we make stress an identifiable villain or problem to be solved? How do we create the rhetorical or marketing or political preconditions so that if, I don't know, a youngish presidential candidate Barack Obama is coming out and making a promise that he wants to improve people's lives, he's not just talking about a healthcare plan, which my old friend John Kitzhaber would call it a sick care plan, but instead talking about a health plan, which would mean, what do we do about public health, which doesn't have as big a budgets as pharmaceutical companies, doesn't have as big a budgets as hospitals, doesn't have as big as budgets as doctors, but has a bigger impact on what most people think of as quality of life and health and life expectancy and heart health, etc. Uh, any moves you've seen other countries do, or even sometimes this country do, to help us do a better job of at least identifying public health or the predeterminants of public health or stress itself as something that seems real and actionable and a priority?
I'm glad you mentioned Fritz Kitzhaber, because that's the first person I heard utter the phrase, "Do you want health or health care?" So I always think of major speaking points or one-liners. So what to do? I mean, there's public health has a bad rap in this country, and it's been tremendously defunded. And the COVID experience, if somebody had said in 2019, the next couple of years you're gonna be facing a contagion that you've never heard of before, and it's going to kill 1,100,000 people in this country and totally change your life, you would have discounted that person. And so the COVID situation, I think we're at the end of the beginning. That is, it's going to be around for a long time. What are we going to do about it is, well, I think we have to regain the trust of the American people for one another and for the government. And that's going to come from more upstream practices to decrease inequality. One way of doing that is a phrase that I heard from the CEO of Intel some years back. You get what you measure. What do we measure every minute of every business day in this country? The stock market indices, the NASDAQ, the Dow Jones. That must be the most important measure in this country, since we report it every minute of every business day. We report economic growth every month. And as you pointed out earlier, it's not making us healthier. What else might we report? Well, Jim Hightower used the phrase, the Doug Jones Index. How's Doug and his family doing? And, what's his life like? Is he sick now? Is he going to not live very long? Is he going to commit suicide or deaths of despair? This is an idea that surfaced in the last 5-6 years. Annie Case and Angus Deaton were looking at mortality measures related to ages among racialized groups in the United States and comparing them to people in other rich countries. And what they found was in the 45 to 55 age range, mortality rates for American whites were not declining as they were for other racialized groups in the country over the last 20 years. They were flat. In other words, mortality rates among middle-aged American white people didn't see the health improvements that others did. They then tracked, what were these people dying from? There were a preponderance of deaths from alcohol abuse, suicides, and other substance use. About 100,000 people in a year in this country, more now, die from opioid overdoses. Why do we consume 3/4 of the world's opioids? Why? Well, America's a highly stressed society. We have a lot of pain. Pain comes in two flavors: physical pain, I punch you. Social pain, I'm feeling the stress of society. In experimental situations, even acetaminophen Tylenol will treat social pain. But boy, opioids do it much better. So back to deaths of despair. Middle-aged whites were not achieving the American dream. You're supposed to be owning your home and sending your kids to college and awaiting your grandchildren, and it's not happening. So you despair and you try to cope, whether it's taking your life, drinking too much, too many opioids. These were measured by liver disease and so on. And there's a book about by them on this title, Deaths of Despair. And they sort of believe that American capitalism can be saved to change this situation. So that's
Yeah. And you're
a
right.
new,
Yeah, you right that we suffer great social pain in America. I was going to ask you about it, and you already answered it. I didn't mean to cut you off. I did because you teased it earlier. I did want to talk explicitly about race before we wrap, but we can more explicitly discuss racism as a social health determinant. And you already sort of made that case. But you also break down that there are sort of different forms of racism. And you might explain some of those different forms and how that impacts health.
so when I talk about, so first of all, what I have noticed to be a tremendous change among my students in the last, say, 10 years is they now recognize racism as a, sort of a fundamental cause of problems in this country, health problems. And that didn't used to be the case. And I think it's their realization that has got the rest of us to sort of unpack these ideas. So there are a paper that in 1995 talked about the fundamental causes of health situations. And inequality is one of those fundamental causes. Racism has also been described as a fundamental cause of health inequities. So I then talk about racism in my class by beginning by showing a 1-minute video that and these days I have to give the students a trigger warning. This is uncomfortable stuff. And the video is called Black Doll, White Doll. And if you search the web, you'll find that 1-minute video by MSNBC. And it goes back to studies done at Clark University by Black researchers in the 1930s.
Yeah, and it was used to inform Brown versus Board of Education litigation strategy.
Yes. So there are even movies of the original studies from Clark University in the 1930s. Anyway, in this 1-minute video, Black children presented with black and white dolls choose the white doll as the pretty doll. Why not the black doll? That doll is bad. That's the bad doll. That's really tough. So that represents internalized racism. Even if you're, just growing up in this country as an African American, you've already internalized what that 1-minute video represented. And then there's personalized racism. You see an African American going down the street, and so you cross to the other side of the street. I mean, you are reacting in a way that voices your prejudice. Then institutionalized racism. We don't hire a lot of African American researchers in our public health school. We have a prejudice against that. I mean, we don't voice it. We want to. I mean, we now have the Anti-Racism Center for Health, Arch Center, trying to get around these ideas, but it's institutionalized. If you want to get to Harvard, you have a rich white daddy who sends money there, and you'll get in for sure. It's a rigged system.
Let's jump over to politics. If we're going to if we're going to do things at a policy level, right, to impact, I mean, something that happened after you mentioned the Business Week line, something that happened after 1976. And since then, we've seen a reduction in marginal tax rates on upper income Americans, right? We've seen a reduction in enforcement of antitrust laws. We've seen a reduction in estate tax. We've seen sort of I'll use the word cascade, or a series of explicit policy choices to move more wealth to the upper levels that are more likely to benefit people like me than than a lot of other people in the world. What impact beyond federal policies? What impact do liberal or conservative state policies have, not just on wealth inequality themselves, but on lifespan?
So an important study was done. Actually, one of the researchers is here at the University of Washington, but it sort of came out of Syracuse University. They tracked the 50 state life expectancies from 1958 to 2017. And they found, and they tracked states that had more liberal policies in terms of human rights, abortion, incarceration, whole education, and conservative policies in those realms. And what happened was, from about 1958 to the mid 1980s, health was improving faster in the liberal states compared to the conservative. And then in the 1990s, it kind of flatlined. Life expectancy flatlined in the conservative states, and it kept on increasing in the more liberal states. And so, the gap back, the gap among the states in 1958 was pretty small. Remember, inequality was much less then. So as inequality has grown, as states have, through federalism, adopted various policies that benefit certain segments of their society, this is reflected in how long people live in those states. Another study, so that was life expectancy. Another similar study was done with adult mortality, showing also the same factor. So political policies are really the medicine we need if we want to live long, healthy lives. And what kind of policies should they be? Well, liberal policies, that is, we need policies that tax those who have too much and use it for social spending for those who have too little. If we think about social spending, so there's a very important relationship between medical care spending and social spending. In the United States, we spend about 2.5 times what we spend on social spending on medical care. There's not much bang for that buck. Other countries, it's the reverse. They front load social spending. And what kind of social spending are we talking about? Well, let's take a working woman who's pregnant and has her baby. How much paid time off does she get living in the United States after she has her baby? 0, right? We're one of 2 countries in the world that don't have a national policy of paid parental leave. The other country besides the United States is Papua New Guinea, half of a big island north of Australia. Other countries, well, okay, I don't know what it's like in Oregon, but Washington passed a paid maternity leave policy that got funded through a payroll tax in 2019 and took effect in 2020. It only gives you 12 weeks, and the pay is a proportion of your salary.
It's similar to Oregon. I think it's almost identical to Oregon, I think.
Yeah. There's another, so I could devolve to other sort of, but policies. So take a healthy country like Sweden, one of the healthiest in the world. The Swedish government spends more of the government money in the first year of a child's life than in any subsequent year. We don't spend money on the first year of life. We spend it on remedial action for teenagers if we're going to spend any government money. Swedish tax rates are very high. I'd like to show a graph from Piketty's Capital and Ideology of the percentage of the national income that accrues to the government, tracked from 1870 to about 2015. This is one of the most insightful graphs I've come across. Back in the 1800s, governments commanded about 7, 8, 9% of the economy. What did they use that for? Well, build a castle for the king, have a standing army to protect him, and make sure that private property was protected. Somewhere in the early 1900s, countries began to accrue more of the national income to the government. And in Piketty's graph, Sweden maxes out around 55% of the country's income goes to the government. For the United States, it's about 30% after the 1950s. So what does Sweden? So Sweden has high tax rates. That's how the government gets the money. And what do they spend it on? Well, the people. Universal health care, free child care, early life education, parental leave, and so on. What do we spend our 30% on? Well, a big chunk goes to the military, and the rest goes to Social Security for old people like me. That's not going to give us much bang for health. So we need to change our priorities on what we do. You know, governments should raise taxes rather than increase the national debt. The poor people, if you take the richest 400 people in the country, Emmanuel Says and Gabriel Zuckman did this study, they pay a lower percentage of federal, state, and local taxes than the poorest 50%. That's not fair. Warren Buffett sometimes used to say the same thing. But we need a fair system of taxation. We shouldn't increase the national debt to pay for things that can happen if the rich are made to share their wealth. But none of us are going to do this until we recognize that we're dead first. That is, we die younger than people in all these other countries. And that includes the rich. You know, if we look at death rates among the richest segment, I mean, they don't stratify on the death certificate. I don't write, when I used to fill one out working in the emergency department, I didn't write down the wealth of that person because I didn't know it. I did write down their age if I knew it, and some racialized category. So it would be nice if we collected the wealth information on our vital statistics. We don't even collect income information. The only information that might be there is education.
So do we know, because the title, I think importantly, of the book is Inequality Kills Us All. It doesn't say inequality kills poor people. It says inequality kills us all.
Yeah.
You make the case, you use the example in our conversation, and thank you for being so generous with your time today, that if you enter at the front of the airplane and go through first class, that impacts the stress of the people in first class, not just the people who have to walk past first class.
Right.
Any other examples, any other data? You just sort of said, well, we don't have great wealth data and a lot of this stuff that makes the case that it's not just poor people that are impacted by inequality, but it's all of us.
So I may have mentioned this, I can't remember. The oldest old person is never in this country. Yeah. So, you know, if the rich, you know, if Elon Musk was going to live to be 127, I mean, he won't, you know, then inequality probably didn't affect him. But take take notables who didn't live to be very old. They didn't even make age 60. Elvis certainly had a lot of wealth and Graceland. Steve Jobs, you'd think, gosh, such an innovator. He could have made it. Janis Joplin. I mean, take notables who didn't get to be very old. They're a dime a dozen. So that's the hardest thing. The rich would be healthier being less rich in a more equal society. The data on that are very clear.
Well, I want to say thank you so much for joining us. As Dr. Bezruchka of the University of Washington. The book, again, is Inequality Kills Us All. Any other plug you want to make? Do you have a favorite way for people to access the book, or anything else you want to suggest people look at?
Well, I have a website, stephenbezruchka.com, and I put information about the book there. And when media events like this happen, I list them on the book's title page, scrolling down on the right. I would urge you to consider setting up discussions about the book's contents. So get a book and have a book club discussion of it. Invite me to it if you want. I'm happy to. My email is very easy, sabez@uw.edu, or you can also link to me from the book's website. I'd be happy to work with you to make America healthy again.
Doctor, thank you so much for your time and all your work. This was fantastic.
My pleasure. Thank you, Robert Jefferson.
Be well.